finished at it and you say, well, that was 5 years ago.
I'm channeling you.
No, don't.
Right, Jamie Marcus. How can we want to be my boyfriend? What? That's what it said on there. In the chat. I know, it just came off the screen.
YouTube. I'm not YouTube.
Must be looking at.
Silliness.
She's so cool. Oh, that's not fun. Hello?
Say hi for me.
That's brilliant.
Oh, hi, how you doing? I'm okay, I'm about to start tutorial.
Oh,
You mean with Geshe something? That's cool.
a precious garland we're doing. Such a good deal. Just like yeah.
I like working with him. It's kind of, he speaks really fast
Yeah. He explains always.
and very detailed.
Yeah. Very detailed. That's why I like it.
All right, let's do some serious prayers. Let's get down on our knees and pray.
Well,
That means there is also non-serious prayer. Yeah, non-serious prayers, yeah. Taking my prayers very seriously, as you can see. You're protecting my injunction. The scripture text and both all things as again. And staying shines forth as the sun unclouded by the who teaches him 60 ways with depression to all the fathers of his only son. All creatures caught in depression of some sorrow, confused in the darkness of their ignorance, overwhelmed by this suffering. You whose traveling in the rises and stupor of our delusion and brings us on the iron chains of our karma. Those powerful sword of wisdom fused our sufferings wherever prize appear, clearing away the darkness of all the I entreat you, O mind, Joshua, Prince of Bodies, who has completed the 10 stages, achieving the high perfection of our bodies, who has been pure from the beginning. O mind, Joshua, love one with the brilliance of your wisdom, illuminated darkness and close the mind. Enlighten my intelligence, wisdom, sunlight, gains, and the texts that explain them. Refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the highest assembly. Accumulations that I listen to the teachings of my attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the highest assembly. Accumulations I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the highest assembly. From the accumulations that I collect by listening to the teachings, I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit also. Right. So, I'm sure that you were dazzled in the morning session speaking about the Samkhyas and the Nyayakis and wondering what are we talking about. I think that Dechen is full of questions about it. And
It really just got me thinking about, just the debate on around emptiness.
Yeah.
And just why the Samkhyas would and the Nyayakis.
Nyayaki.
That's the way you told me to remember it.
Yeah, Nyayaki.
It just seemed to me that they they don't have the expansive of mind to perceive that the spaciousness of like space and that and atoms, and I think it's quantum physics and the school that we belong to. They've just got so much in common, but they wouldn't have had quantum physics back in those times. So you had to have had a fairly open mind, expansive mind, and these thinkers, their mind just didn't have that capacity to be as expansive, because I get it, you're permanent until you change. I mean, like I am permanent, that I can see why people can think that they are permanent until they change. And for them, that makes sense.
As I've always been like that.
Yeah.
It's like I've always been thinking like that. I never change.
Yeah. But until I change, because ultimately we all know we get old. So you would have to admit that there is some process of change. If you perceive yourself as inherently I, as yourself inherently existing, you couldn't deny the fact that you change and you die. And that's obvious. So there's something else that they perceive as inherent.
Yeah, I mean it's a good note to make, because I think that first of all, it's not that they were foolish. In that if you ask them, what do you mean? Is Dechen born? Does Dechen die? Does Dechen change from I wouldn't say moment to moment, but does she grow old and change? They will, of course, would say yes. They wouldn't be obstinate in saying that no, Dechen always stay the way that she is. So they will speak about two. I think that they will speak about two types of Dechen. The one that is Dechen of this life, and the one that is eternal. So when the Buddha was around, there was, I guess, a vast array of spiritual traditions that existed in India at the time. When you look at Buddhist presentation, the Buddhist presentation narrows them down into five non-Buddhist schools, or the 6 non-Buddhist schools. There are different lists and different classifications, but they looked at some non-Buddhist, the Buddhist tradition looked at Hindu traditions and summarized them into the 5 non-Buddhist schools or the 6 non-Buddhist schools, but they were dealing with a great number of spiritual traditions that existed at the time in India. Some of them were asserting that the world was created by being, and some of them asserted that there is no creator whatsoever. So there were also differences between different spiritual traditions in India. Some of them were contrary to each other, but still. Yeah, the Charvaka schools, for example. The Charvaka school says that there's no past and future lifetime. There is no liberation. What you have in this life is just what it is. But still, in order to simplify the Buddhist presentation, they said that let's look at some similarities between Hindu traditions, and there were many of them, and group them into those philosophies that asserted a degree of permanency and independence. So the Samkhya's that we mentioned in the morning are one group of them. The other ones that we mentioned, the Nyayakis, which are also often classified together with the Vaisheshikas, which is another school of thought, Hindu school of thought. There are some differences between the Nyayakis and the Vaisheshika. Vaisheshika, yeah. But still, so there are differences, but also there are a lot of similarities. Anyway, so I think that for those of you, or those of us who have been in India or read some things about beliefs in India, right? There are different beliefs, but often you come across the term Atman, the self, which has quite a nice, in some sense, romantic description sometimes that you find in literature. Of course, it's very deep, but in a kind of really nice way of describing it. It's like this great ocean of soul, and the Atman is born from that great ocean and at the end goes back to that great ocean, you know. So there's this kind of really nice description. And when the Buddha was alive, he meditated, researched the self, how does the self exist, and then at the end turn against that notion of Atman. Says that the Atman that we speak of in Indian tradition, so the Buddha himself was Indian, right? So it's not that the Buddha came from somewhere else and then objected what existed at the time in India. He arose from those traditions that believed in those views. But then upon the research, he says, oh, actually, it doesn't make sense to me. I think that this type of self, the Atman, doesn't exist. So when we look at now at what Shantideva says here, when he addresses the views of the Vaisheshikas and the Nyayakis and the Samkhyas, he addresses those views that have existed at the time of the Buddha, but also they're likely to have existed at the time that Shantideva was alive. And some of them are still in existence in India, because in India they still speak of Atman, right? So I think that it's not that, it's not necessarily the case that they didn't have the expansive mind to realize emptiness. Of course, you could say that from a Buddhist perspective, that's part of it, but in some sense, kind of they had their own very well-defined spiritual tradition with some assertions that some of them were based on logic. Even if the logic is not flawless, it's still, I think, there are certain philosophies that have evolved through generations, centuries, and so forth to become just religions. I mean, we don't find it only in India. When you think of theistic religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and so forth, you know, also in those traditions, quantum physics was definitely not taking the front seat in the philosophies of those traditions. And now you can say that there are probably scientists that are Christians, or scientists that are Jews, or scientists that are Muslims practicing, but it's not necessarily that would be part of their philosophy. I mean, you can probably find some philosophical quotations or theories within theistic religions that would bear some similarities with quantum physics, but they were just developed in, I think, on their own terms, on their own ground. But anyway, while we're speaking of the Samkhyas and so forth, how do we get to speak about them? To begin with, I think that to understand what Shantideva is saying here, it's good to look at why is he actually dealing with those non-Buddhist schools to begin with. Why are we speaking about them here in the Patience chapter and not just leaving them to the Wisdom chapter? Normally you refute the views of non-Buddhist schools of thought when you deal with wisdom. In that when you develop wisdom, you want to understand the emptiness of the self. In order to understand the emptiness of the self, or selflessness, you deal with, first of all, those that assert a coarse type of self. So you negate that. Then, no, so that is asserted by non-Buddhist schools of thought. Then you start dealing with a more subtle type of self that is asserted by Buddhist schools of thought, and you negate that. And you make your way till you develop a better understanding of the selflessness that is asserted by the Madhyamika Prasanka school of thought. So this is what you do normally when you deal with the wisdom, developing the perfection of wisdom, wisdom realizing emptiness, the correct view, and so forth. So why are we speaking about it here in the Patience chapter?
Because when we get angry at someone, it's like we do all of that. We make them something separate, permanent, out there, source of all my harm, dependent from me, and so forth. So it's just to counteract that in our own minds.
Yeah, that's part of it. Kind of, you said that kind of it also happens to us when we get angry. Since it's the person that we get angry with, the harm-doer, appears to our mind to exist independently in and of themselves, unrelated to us, unrelated to the way that we perceive that person. So that sense of independency is what dawns to our mind.
And that they're not in control of their mind, that it causes them conditions and afflictions, etc. So to not be angry at the person, basically it's not their fault that they're angry.
All right. So the person that is harming you and the anger of that person do not exist independently. They depend upon cause and conditions. So you want to also look at the dependency upon cause and conditions in order to understand that that does not occur independently by its own power. Yes. I think that both of you are going kind of in, I wouldn't say kind of right direction in the sense of giving you kind of a mark, but I think that kind of it's related to what I'm trying to.
And getting an ultimate attitude, that usually
Well, when I look at the outline, let's look at the outline. It's on the screen. So it says, in cultivating the patience that is intent on the Dhamma, we begin as both fury and the one who is furious, etc., rely upon causes. They are not independent. So this is what both of you have said. So neither fury nor the furious person is independent. And then the second point says that their causes and conditions are also not independent. So how do we translate that into conversational language? And if we just kind of describe it in a free flow, you get angry at a harm doer. Shantideva is saying that why are you getting angry at that person? You don't get angry at sickness, and sickness causes you harm. Why are you getting angry at a person if they cause you harm, if you don't get angry at sickness? So you would say...
sickness doesn't arise volitionally.
Yeah, because sickness doesn't arise volitionally. The sickness doesn't have, it doesn't think, I want to harm you. Whereas we say a person does have that intention to harm us. And then we think, is the person independent? Is the wish to harm us, does it arise independently? We say it doesn't arise independently. It arises also due to cause and conditions, right? So the person is getting angry and harming me because they're ignorant, because they experience a certain situation which makes them unhappy. They do not have control over the process, and because of that, they're harming me. Right? So they harm me because of cause and conditions. Anger doesn't think I shall arise. Anger arises and depends upon cause and conditions. So that's what Shantideva said before, right? So it says that also those causes and conditions in turn do not exist independently. They also depend upon other causes and conditions, right? So it says their causes and conditions are also not independent. Let's briefly look at this verse on the screen. These conditions that assemble together have no intention I shall produce. And neither does the produce by them have the intention I will be produced, right? So none of them have a sense of independence. So this is what we've said up until now. So the final line in what Shantideva says is that causes and conditions also lack independence in production. So then if you kind of try to imagine a situation where Shantideva is presenting that, I mean, this is an imaginary situation, but let's say that he's speaking about that, trying to convince an audience that it is unreasonable to become angry with another person because they are not independent. And also the cause and conditions of that person, the cause and conditions of their anger are not independent. Then a non-Buddhist person in the audience, a Samkhya person, or a Nyayaka person, would put the hand up at this point in time and say that, what do you mean causes and conditions are not independent? Causes and conditions, there are causes and conditions that are independent, because in our philosophy, we assert that there are some causes that are independent. There are some causes that are permanent. So who asserts that? Samkhyas and the Nyayakas. So they're putting forward, in an imaginary way, objection to what Shantideva is saying. He's saying that cause and conditions are not independent. They always depend upon others. They say, hang on, this is incorrect. In our philosophy, there are independent causes. So this is this point in time where they start to speak of what the Samkhyas are saying and the Nyayaka are saying. Is that, before we get to their position, is this scenario clear, or do you have any questions? All right, so what are the independent causes, permanent causes that they speak of? So we have two schools of thought. So the Samkhyas, to begin with, are a school of thought that has many assertions. The Samkhyas, I have it on the screen, I'll put it, it's S-A-M-K-H-Y-A. I'll put it on the screen. That's the Samkhyas. And the second is the Nyayakis. There are Indian schools of thought, Indian philosophies. Yeah, non-Buddhist. I'm not sure about the spelling of the Nyayakis. As you can see, I spell it differently. Maybe I'll work on it later on. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. And that's not the least of my problems with those schools of thought. Yeah. So, so to begin with the Samkhyas, they have many assertions, but one of the things that they assert, I think that we briefly spoke about it yesterday, they say that there's something that is called a principle. It's like something that is a cause, but it's not an effect. So in our school, in the Buddhist school of thought, if it's a cause, it's an effect. If it's an effect, it's also necessarily a cause, right? So cause and effect, for example, now my computer, this computer is a cause, but it's also an effect. This book is a cause, but it's also an effect. What is it a cause of? There's a cause, you can say it's a cause of the next moment of book. It's a cause of, you can say, the ash and other remains that will be there after I set fire to this book. What is it? No, not with vengeance, just Dharma burning, simple Dharma burning. It is a result of what? Of a tree, right? So it is a cause and a result. So the Samkhyas, so according to Buddhist schools of thought, a cause is necessarily an effect, and effect is necessarily a cause. According to the Samkhyas, they say that we disagree with that. We have something that is a cause, but it's not an effect. What is it? It is, for example, the general principle. It is a cause, but it's not an effect of anything. So it seems that according to them, the general principle has this collection of different qualities, different characteristics, but what they say is that everything around us is a manifestation or expression of that nature. So there is a permanent nature that pervades everything, that everything around us. So for example, an intention to harm seems to have the nature of that principle. So it is a cause, but it's not an effect. Not only it's a cause, it's also a permanent cause, because they assert that this principle that is a cause but not an effect is also permanent. So what they're saying is that when Shantideva is saying that causes and conditions are also other powered, they're not independent, they say, sorry, we disagree. The principle is independent. It is a cause, but it is independent. It is unproduced. It has the power to produce, but it in itself is unproduced because it is permanent. That's one example that they come up with. The second example that I come up with is also a person. So they say that there is a person that is permanent. This is what they assert according to their tradition. Also, the person that is permanent is has different characteristics. But if you think about it in terms of different spiritual traditions that have existed in India since thousands of years, many of them speak of past and future lifetimes, and many of them speak about samsara, about liberation. So the Buddhist tradition is not the only tradition that uses those terms, samsara and nirvana. Also, others, Hindu traditions speak about it, but they have a different explanation of the mechanism of samsara and nirvana. So what do the Samkhya's say? In general, it seems that what they say is that there is a cause that is the general principle. It is a cause of books and water and fire and ice cream, chocolate cakes, microphones, cameras, and so forth. It is the origin of all of them. It is the nature of all of them. But it doesn't have the thought, I will generate. It doesn't have the intention to generate. So it is a cause, but it lacks that intentionality. And then you have the person. The person is permanent, and the person has wishes, wants. Person wants ice cream. Person wants to work the field, plant seeds, grow different things, right? So the person wants something, and then it is created by the principle. So the origin for that is the principle. How exactly it works, I don't know, I'm not sure. But, I think that we read yesterday through that really nice free-flowing, I don't know if it's free-flowing description, but it's like the principle is like a blind person with legs. So the legs can walk somewhere, but they don't see where they go. And the person is a disabled person. Is a cripple kind of not the politically correct term to use? All right. It's like a disabled person that can see where to go, but they cannot do it by themselves. So upon that combination of the general principle and the person that wants things, things come to be. So how do we cycle in samsara according to the Samkhyas? Is through mistaking the person and the principle to be the same thing. How do we get out of samsara? Through understanding they're not the same thing. This is what the Samkhyas say.
But what is it sort of mistaking the person and the principle to be the same thing?
Yeah, to be one in nature.
Who's mistaking it? The Samkhyas?
No, they said that we are in samsara because we make the mistake of taking them to be the same thing, the same nature.
That we are in samsara
Yeah.
because we think that ourselves and samsara are the same nature.
No, that are self and the principle.
Self and the principle.
Yeah. This is what the Samkhyas believe. Yeah. Yeah, so it's not what we believe. This is what the Samkhyas believe.
Mistaking the person and the principle to be the same thing. That's
The same, yeah.
That's what the Samkhyas are doing. They're mistaking that
Yeah.
the person and the principle are the same thing.
Yeah.
Say the principle could be another term for the concept of consciousness, conscious dream.
No, they have another group of phenomena which are both causes and effects, and consciousness is part of them. So they separate between kind of a person and consciousness are not the same thing. They have a conscious being, but a conscious being, a person, the self, is not consciousness.
So the principle is a factor that they've developed that we don't have anything equivalent.
No. They said that it's the permanent thing that pervades everything around us in motion and at rest. It has that permanent nature to it. So, so there are different reasons why they said that. Like, for example, if you think of their assertions, we go from one lifetime to the next, and we will continue to go from one lifetime to the next until we undo our mistakes, until we resolve our mistakes. So there's a person that is always there. If a person is always there, that person has to be permanent because the person is always there. And the person has to be the one that is now in samsara and then will be liberated. Since the person is always there and it's the same person, they say it's permanent. I mean, of course, it's probably simplifying what they're saying, but I think that that's part of the rationale behind their assertion. So again, we'll go one step backwards. Shantideva is saying that there are, so a person that is getting angry at you and the anger are not independent. They depend upon cause and conditions. And in turn, cause and conditions also depend upon other cause and conditions. They do not exist independently. So the Samkhyas raised their hand and said that we disagree. A person exists independently, the self exists independently. The principle exists independently. So what does Shantideva say to that? He says, that which is asserted as the principle and that which is imputed as the self, right? So this is what you guys say, the principle and what you guys call the self do not arise after having purposefully thought I shall arise. So he's telling the Samkhyas, let's look at what you assert. You assert something that is unproduced, it is permanent, it doesn't have the thought I shall arise, it is unborn, it is unproduced. So how can it has the thought I shall arise? And also, if they're not produced and non-existent, what is asserted to be produced at that time? So it's quite cryptic, right? Let's try to put this list of arguments and counter arguments one after another. So this is what I did at home in my tutorial notes. So sorry, I didn't. So I didn't share the screen with the verse. So that which is asserted as the principle and that which is imputed as the self, these two are assertions of the Samkhyas. So they do not arise after having purposefully thought I shall arise. If they are not produced and non-existent, what is asserted to be produced at that time? So at home I put it in my class notes in the following way. So all right. All right, let's begin with that. Verses.
Oi.
When it's, Oi.
Right.
Okay, so verses 27 to 30 refute the existence of independent causes and conditions. So this refutation comes on the tail of having asserted that anger does not arise by its own power, it arises in dependence upon others. So the Samkhyas say that independent causes do exist. Now, Khenpo Kumpa's commentary, this one, in page 206 explains that they assert the person and the principle to be autonomous entities, which means autonomous independent entities, and that there are origins of an aggressive attitude of an enemy. So therefore they say that when you look at anger of another person, the person is harming you. The Samkhya school says that the cause of that anger is an independent cause. It's not something that depends upon other cause and condition. It is an independent cause. Thus, they assert the person and the principle to be independent causes. So this is how the debate goes. So Shantideva in verses 22 to 25 says, anger and an angry persons do not exist independently. They rely on causes, verses 22 and 25. And then verse 26, causes also are not independent. They rely on other causes and conditions. That's how Shantideva begins. The Samkhya's then raise their hand and say, independent causes do exist. I beg to differ. Independent causes do exist. The general principle and the self are independent, right? So they assert the principle to be permanent, independent, a cause, but not a result. There are permanent causes that produce results. This is what the Samkhya's assert. So Shantideva says in verse 27 and then 28, this is not possible. Why is it not possible? First off, a permanent principle is asserted as unborn. Unborn, you can also call it unproduced, right? So if something is unborn and unproduced, you can say there are two alternatives here. If it is unborn and unproduced, it could be permanent. Emptiness, for example, is permanent, right? Do you agree that emptiness is permanent? So it is unproduced because it's not produced by cause and conditions. It is unborn because it's not produced by cause and conditions. That's one alternative. Another alternative is horns of a rabbit, flying pigs, skyflower, pigeon horse.
Pigeon what?
Horse.
Horse.
Yeah, a pigeon horse doesn't exist, does it?
A pigeon horse.
Yeah. Well, it's it seems like kind of, it's not a field of knowledge, it's not an object of knowledge. It's
No, it's not.
yeah, it doesn't exist, a pigeon horse. So
Yet.
yes, we haven't cloned, we haven't kind of created in hybrid. So you can say that since that thing, so that's the second alternative of something that is unborn or unproduced. It doesn't exist like horns of a rabbit. It is unborn, unproduced like horns of a rabbit. So two alternatives for understanding the word unborn, unproduced. So the principle, you can say that it is unborn and unproduced because it's permanent. It is something that is called self-arisen, in that it hasn't arisen by other cause and conditions. It just exists by itself. It is permanent. This is what they say. So Shantideva says, let's look at that general principle. It is asserted as unborn. As it is permanent and independent, there's nothing that can bring it into existence, into being. Therefore, it is like horns of a rabbit. It is non-existent. Something that is unborn, nothing can bring it into existence, is like horns of a rabbit. What you assert to be the principle doesn't exist. This is what Shantideva says to begin with. Then he also says in his argumentation, but let's look at how you speak about it as being permanent. A permanent principle cannot perform actions. So if you speak about that as origin of creation, if it's permanent, how can it create something? Can something that is unproduced, unborn, permanent, can it produce something else? Can the action of production be attributed to it if it is permanent? Not possible, because only something that is impermanent can produce. Something that is permanent cannot produce. So that's the second thing that Shantideva says. Third thing is its expressions or manifestations are independent from it, and therefore they're also unrelated to it. So according to the Samkhyas, they say that the principle is the source, the cause, the origins of all the manifestations and expressions around us. So all the things around us are manifestation expressions of the principle.
The principle itself is unmanifested.
Is unborn, unproduced, impermanent, permanent. You can say that probably also unmanifest, I think. Yeah, this is, I think, one of his qualities.
They will manifest.
To be evident, to be obvious, evident to us. So Shantideva says, well, if you have a permanent thing that cannot act because it's permanent, but then there are expressions which are impermanent, they're unrelated to each other. So how can the principle be related to its expressions, to its manifestation? So it's picking up faults in the Samkhya's positions. But also the second position of the Samkhya's was with respect to the self. So the self is also permanent, they say, a conscious being. It has wishes, and because of its wishes, because of the attachment that the permanent being has, the principle creates different manifestations. This is what they believe. So Shantideva says, let's look at a second thing that you assert, a permanent person. A permanent self, right? So it says, the self is asserted to be permanent and unborn. As it is permanent and independent, there's nothing that can bring it into existence. So it's just like the principle. It is permanent, it is independent. There's nothing that can bring it into existence. Therefore, it is like a horns of a rabbit. It doesn't exist. Then also this permanent self cannot perform actions. The permanent self, how can it act if it is permanent?
Because it's unborn.
Yeah, it cannot act because it is unborn. It is permanent. It is not produced. A permanent self cannot independently experience objects. I mean, if there's something that is independent, to have an experience of something, there needs to be transformation that occurs. Like, for example, I can experience heat. If I experience heat, it means that there had to be a transformation that allowed me to experience heat. I experience a sense of coolness. To have that experience of coolness, there must have been a transformation that has occurred. Because if there was had there been no transformation that had occurred, how can I experience coolness? It would be either that I will experience coolness all the time, or coolness never would experience coolness. In order for that to be an intermittent experience, something needs to change. If it's a permanent person, how can there be a transformation that will allow an experience of an object to occur?
Would you say that the general principle is kind of like the holodeck on Star Trek?
That the general principle is like the holodeck on Star Trek, which beams something up and down?
No. It creates a whole environment of like what you desire, you want to be a part of, and they go into like those things and like, you know, experience all these pretend things, and it's generated just for them.
So Star Trek was created by the Samkhya.
Maybe the Bodhisattva actually, you know, had that in mind when he did it.
Trying to fit it in with God.
I don't know.
Sounds very creationist, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It sounds very creationist.
I'll just clarify one thing, that we're actually talking about principle spelled P-L-E, not P-A-L.
PAL.
Yeah.
Principle PAL.
Yes.
AL.
So it's the main, the principle spelled that way, it's like the main.
The main.
Yeah.
The main thing.
Dallas, and also I think that Olaf in the morning referred to another translation of the thing which is primal substance. The word, I mean, it's a different translation, but the word substance is not found in the actual Tibetan. You know, in Tibetan, the word that is used is just principle, main, which is it's a translation of the Sanskrit word that is called prakriti. I think that probably when you look at commentaries, they explain what it is.
I think it's Purusha.
Now, Purusha is the person. Purusha is person,
Okay.
and the principle is
another translation in English is unmanifested nature.
okay. Yeah, I think that probably in my class notes, the previous section explains the qualities of this principle. So it is the agent of actions, it is unproduced and permanent, it is unitary, only an object and not an object possessor. It pervades everything. It is not manifest. And they said that it's also an equilibrium of three qualities: activity, lightness, and darkness, whatever it means.
Yeah, actually I mentioned Prakriti in that book.
Okay. So,
Prakriti.
Prakriti, yeah.
Page 206.
Yeah. And then to seal the deal with respect to Shantideva's finding flaws in the Samkhya's position, he says also, if a person is permanent, they will always be apprehending an object, because moving towards an object will occur permanently without changing, and that will be an absurdity according to the Samkhyas. So let's look at what Shantideva says. He says in the next section in verse 28, since it would always be distracted to its objects, it follows that it will never cease. So that is referring to the assertion of a person, the self. They said that a self is permanent. If the self is permanent, Shantideva says, how does it work? There is a movement towards an object. How does a person come to apprehend an object? Like, for example, I have this in front of me. I can now apprehend it. If I do not, you can say that if I don't hold it, if I don't look at it, if I don't think about it, it can be there, but I'm not apprehending it. In order for me to apprehend it, there needs to be a movement towards this object, or distraction towards that object. So if a person is permanent, how does this movement occur? Either there always have to be a movement without changing because the person is permanent, or you can say the other thing that Shantideva did not say here at all, but you can say that, or there would be no movement whatsoever that is possible because the person is permanent. But let's say that, let's go with the first option. Since the person is permanent, there will always be movement, because there would be no transformation between movement and not movement. It will then follow that there will always be apprehension of this.
You're saying it would be movement because there would always be distraction to the object. So
Yeah.
there has to be.
I mean, often when you look at finding faults or absurd consequences in different things, they say that, for example, if an inherently existent cause produces an inherently existent result, it means that the cause and effect are unrelated. They exist independently and therefore they're unrelated. So there are two main consequences to that. Either that nothing will be produced because they're unrelated, or everything will produce everything because they're unrelated. Right? So those are two absurd consequences, which you can say that in some sense are negating each other, but both of them are valid if things exist inherently. So also, I think that in relation to that, you can say that if the self is permanent, it will always be moving towards an object, or at the same time, it will never be moving towards an object because it cannot change.
Underlying substratum is another term.
I think that, that's when you're saying that underlying substratum is another term Isonis uses. I think that probably it's not the term that Isonis uses, it's the term of the translator, because Isonis, I guess, that taught it in Tibetan, which uses only one word, chi. Now the word for that in Tibetan is chi. In English, it is, different translators translated as the principle substance, the underlying substratum. So I think that the English translation is done according to the way that the translator understood it. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is incorrect. I mean, it is difficult to translate. I think that often when we work with English translations, some of the understanding of the term, what it means, is interwoven into the translation. No,
I mean,
the
they're
choice of
highly
words.
Intelligent, so it'd be hard to say that just because you had a wish for an ice cream, it would manifest.
Well, I think that they would certainly say that they would certainly. No, they weren't simplistic. I think that to just give you an explanation of what they say that, for example, they call it production from self. So production from self is, for example, saying that you have a seed of rice, and the rice. So the Samkhya says something in the following way. I'm paraphrasing it, saying it in a loose sense, so it's not necessarily absolutely precise, but it's saying something like that. At the time of seed, the rice doesn't exist. Do you agree?
Yes.
At the time of the seed of rice, the sprout doesn't exist. Sorry?
I'm sorry to say that there's a little embryo inside the seed.
Well, no, they say, no, at the time of seed, the plant doesn't exist. It's still a seed. So the Samkhya say that, well, if you then say that it is possible for rice to grow from seed, you're basically saying that a non-existent rice, that rice is an existent thing, arises from non-existent rice because it didn't exist before, and therefore, it didn't exist before, and then it was produced. So you're saying that a non-existent gave rise to an existent. So that is not possible. So they say that the rice has to exist at the time of the seed. How does it exist at the time of the seed? It exists as non-apparent. It is there, but you can't see it. It doesn't appear. So how does it arise? It arises from that nature, from the principle. And what they call production or generation of rice, it is the stage in which it goes from non-apparent to being apparent. So a seed, so they say that a rice is produced from its seed. Of course, they're not stupid. They would say that rice arises from its seed because otherwise they would not be working in fields, they would not be making ice creams. I wonder if they did make ice creams. But no, the Samkhya's would not be producing iPhones and so forth because they would say that they would not be producing those things if they believe that those things don't have causes. So of course they believe that they have causes, but they say that also on top of that, if they didn't have that thing that existed before, that principle that allowed them to come into being, it would be just like a non-existent becoming existent.
So you have to say everything has its potentiality.
Everything has potentiality. Well, when you say potentiality,
It's a potential rice.
plant. Well, they don't describe it like that because a potential sounds like something that has a function, whereas to say that this principle, which is the nature of rice, the principle is permanent. It is a cause, but it's not an effect. A potential sounds like, I don't know. Yeah. It sounds like?
Very similar to the debate about Buddha nature. Buddha nature is potential to be developed from an artist's certainly that Buddha has already existed within Buddha nature.
Well, I don't know if they I mean, it might sound similar to Buddha nature, but I don't know if they actually speak about Buddha, if they speak about Buddha nature and so forth. I think that we might find some similarities in the words, but I don't think that this is what they meant when they spoke about the principle that is the cause for everything.
No, whenever I've tried to make comparisons like that, the Tibetan person that I'm saying is to sort of look at me in a bewildered way, because We're talking about something completely different. And they find it really difficult to, they don't cross. You know, we're talking about this at the moment, we're not talking about that. You know, so they find it really difficult to cross over the principle that you're actually highlighting there. That's the right thing. We're not trying to do
But it seems like there'd be nothing new because everything already has its.
Yeah, that's part of the Madhyamika Prasangika's. Yeah, they say that, you know, if, for example, a rice exists at the time of its cause, the seed, what's the point of production? Production would be made completely of no purpose. This is what you find at the beginning of the 6th chapter of Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way. So anyway, without going into a lot of details with respect to the Samkhya's, I just wanted you to hold. Yeah, too late. No, well, you can make it.
Way too late.
Yeah, sorry. No, actually, you can make it even more complicated. But yeah, I think that kind of holding kind of still. I think that it's important at least to. That's kind of that's like techniques of avoiding hard questions, isn't it? Before we get too deep into that, let's just look at the general outline.
Yeah.
The point is that Shantideva is saying that a person is not independent. Angry person is not independent. They depend upon cause and conditions, and their cause and conditions depend upon other cause and conditions. The Samkhya is saying that we disagree because we have some causes which are independent. The principle and the person. Shantideva says you got it wrong. You got it wrong. All right. Then do you have the same? Then you have the next school of thought, which is the Nyayakis, Nyayakis. So what are they saying? So they're saying,
You've run out of time.
yeah, well, 4 minutes, we can do it. It's almost the same. I mean, we've covered that in Geshe-la's class, so no, it's not that hard. They said the self to be permanent and unconscious. What it means, we don't have to go into that. Unconscious, unconscionable. Anyway, they assert a person to be permanent. And though it is permanent, it can meet extraneous minds and become causally effective. So they say that there is a person that is permanent. They say Atman, right? There's Atman, a person, permanent, but it can still act. It can meet with minds and then become effective. So Shantideva, and that person is an independent cause. It is an independent cause. It is permanent, functioning thing. It is permanent because they assert a person to be permanent, but also it's functioning thing because it can act. So Shantideva says there is a contradiction here. How can you assert something that is permanent that can still act? What makes it act? So they say conditions make it act. Shantideva says, if something is permanent, can conditions affect it? If you say that conditions affect it so that it produces a result, it has to change. How can something be affected by conditions without changing? If it's not changing, it's not affected by conditions. So they say that, no, it is affected by conditions because it produces a result because of those conditions. And Shantideva says, how can it be? The results are not related to the cause. The conditions are totally unrelated to a permanent thing. So how this debate goes in brief. Again, we go back to the same verses 22 to 25. Anger and the angry person do not exist independently. They rely on causes. Causes are also not independent. They rely on other causes and conditions in verse 26. The Nyayakis in the audience put the hand up. They say independent causes do exist. For example, the self is a permanent functionality. So it is an independent cause, an autonomous cause. Shantideva says a permanent functionality doesn't exist because it is impossible for an uncompounded phenomenon to produce its own effect. If it's permanent, if it's uncompounded, it's not possible for it to produce an effect. Nyayakis go back to it and say, it is permanent indeed, but when met with conditions, a result arises.
So similar to the Samkhyas.
Yeah. Shantideva says it is not possible for a permanent phenomenon to meet with conditions. They still hold their ground and say the self does not contribute to actions of the same permanent nature. Its actions are of different entities to it. So what they're saying is that they say that a person is permanent. So the person doesn't really do something with the actions. The actions are something different to it. The actions, activities, are those things that act. It's not the person that is acting. So Shantideva is saying that, what are you on about? You know, if the person is permanent, but its actions are unrelated to it, how do you connect them together? They're totally unrelated to the person. How can a person meet with conditions which are unrelated to it?
And that's what it's that last slide.
Yeah.
The relevance of the Samkhyas and the Nyayakis
Yeah.
and patience, because you need patience to get through to these. Oh,
So Shanti Jane was a patient
Yeah.
is all in relation to the
Yeah.
skills and all that.
that's why we have that.
Well, so our time is up. Happily ever after. But I think that what we can do now, I mean, of course, this is one way that you can look at this section is to think that that was intellectually and academically interesting, or maybe totally boring. It's interesting. I find it interesting. I find it kind of intellectually, I think, challenging. You know, sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. But then we still then need to think of, how does this material relate to me? I mean, this, and also this is the advice that we got from his honest, that we get from the Geshes. So how does this position of the Samkhyas and the Nyayakis related to us? So although we don't hold these philosophies, we don't think about it on this then, still, I think that we can find patterns which are similar to it. In that, within that, for example, you know, we get angry at someone that does something that we dislike. So when someone says that the person is not independent, we still hold on to that thing that no, they are independent because they have this malicious intent. You know, the malicious intent is independent. It will never change. The person will always be bad. You know, there's something negative about them that will never change. I mean, even if we don't state it like that, I think that often we have that idea that there is something inherently bad with a certain person that will never change. So although it might not be exactly what the Samkhyas are saying, still I think that what I'm trying to say is that when you look at this position, you can still think that, how do I view a harm doer? How do I do someone that gives me what I dislike? And find ways to work with Shantideva's argumentation here, even if it's not the position stuff we hold, but still kind of work with those argumentations in order to counteract that idea that there's something inherently bad in that person, independently bad in that person.
Oh, incredible, Naki. Well done.
Well, maybe I just kind of made a mess out of it.
No, you wrapped that up beautifully with the bow at the very end. Very nicely done.
That's the time to go swimming. Yeah.
What a cop out.
So I saw that there were a few notes and questions here. Maybe we'll take them tomorrow, if you're still up to it, but we'll dedicate it for now. Due to this virtue, man quickly become a Guru Buddha and lead all transparent creative beings without exception to that state. May the may that the reason not decline, but increase more and more. In this land encircled by snowy mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good, all powerful, generous, cleansing. Please remain until samsara ends. You uphold the subdued small way yourselves and the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, spreading. Mercifully accomplishes magnificent prayer, honoring the three jewels, protector of myself and others, your disciples. Please live long.
And will you update the tube notes
Yeah, I'll do it now. No worries.
But is Christianity, Judeo-Christian religions, have they been the same perspective as those two Indian schools?
No, they've originated completely at different times, different places.
With the Indian schools, with that position they have, are they of a creator? Do they have a creator? Because there is Genesis, whereas Buddhism is
I think that I'm not totally, I'm not versed at all in what they believe, but some of those traditions believe that there are different beings that are responsible for different aspects. So there is one, in Judeo-Christian tradition, you can say that God is a creator and also a destroyer, someone that rewards and someone that punishes. Whereas in some Hindu traditions, there's someone that creates and another person that punishes, someone that creates and another one that destroys.
As an opposite validates it as not being that Indian way.
Sorry?
It has an opposite. It has an opposing force, so does that allow for changeability? Whereas if it's just created, people being the destroyer as well, that the deduction.
Well, I'm not so sure because I haven't really studied those traditions at depth, at length. So I can't say that it is completely contradictory.
Not as simple as God, G-O-D, is generator, operator, and destructor. It's the same thing.
I thought it was good orderly direction. That's what I thought. Good orderly direction, God. Generator, operator, and destroyer.
Destructor.